Hello, literary lovers, and welcome to 21 Conversations, the 2021 Greensboro-bound Literary Festival. I am Paula Pierce, one of the board members of Greensboro Literary Organization. Greensboro-bound is so excited to present to you these 21 conversations, our effort to create something unique and special for our community within the confines of our continued virtual environment. 21 Conversations pays homage to North Carolina's rich literary history while broadening our tent to welcome in voices from outside our own microcosm of experience. This featured presentation is but a taste of the 52 authors that we have gathered together in a series of delightful, sometimes unexpected, but always edifying conversations. Since our inception, Greensboro Bound has been committed to providing programs like the one you are about to watch, 100% free to our community. In order to do that, we need the financial support, both big and small, of readers just like you. Please support Greensboro Bound by giving now. The text to give phone number, as well as our website, are on your screen. A sustaining gift of just $15 a month or the cost of a single children's book will help us remain financially solvent throughout the year. I also want to take a moment to thank our sustaining supporters, without whom Greensboro Bound would not be possible. Our utmost gratitude to the Edward M. Armfield Senior Foundation, the Ruth Lands Memorial Fund, and Arts Greensboro for their continued belief in our vision to bring together readers and writers of all genres, ages, ethnicities, identities, and voices to foster an understanding of writing, a process that allows free expression, deepens critical thought, and helps sustain a culture of inquiry and delight that is open to all. Thank you again for joining us for the 2021 Greensboro Bound Literary Festival. Please enjoy the conversation.
Welcome, everybody. My name is ANN CAHILL. I'm a professor of philosophy at Elon University, and I am absolutely delighted to host this panel with these two incredibly impressive authors as part of the Greensboro Bound Literary Festival. We're so lucky to live in a city that has an annual literary festival that brings together thinkers, writers, artists of all stripes. And today's conversation is going to be about two books that are remarkably different with remarkable connections across them. This is going to be a very lively conversation. I have assured the two authors that they have no idea what I'm going to ask them. So they're on the edge of their seats. I'm on the edge of my seats because I can't wait to talk to them some more. So I'm going to give you a brief introduction of these two amazing thinkers and their very recent works. And then we're going to talk about some of the ways in which they have created new ground, new questions, brought new realities to the fore that really challenge many presuppositions. So first, I would like to introduce Dr. Shanna Greene Benjamin, who is at the top of my screen. I have no idea where she is on your screen. She is a biographer and scholar who studies the literature, lives, and archives of Black women. Dr. Benjamin earned her PhD in English in English and her master's in Afro-American Studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, a university which plays a very important role in her work. And she received a BA in English from Johnson C. Smith University, a historically Black college in Charlotte, North Carolina. A Mellon Mays undergraduate fellow who now serves on the UNCF Mellon Board of Advisors, Dr. Benjamin currently lives with her family in Charlotte, North Carolina. And we're here to talk about her brand new, like hot off the presses book, Half in Shadow, The Life and Legacy of Nellie Y. McKay, published by the University of North Carolina Press. So welcome, Dr. Benjamin. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Anne.
Great. And then we have with us Dr. Lisa Levenstein. And I'm sorry, am I pronouncing that correctly? Oh, good. She's the director of Women's Gender Sexuality Studies and Associate Professor of History at University of North Carolina in Greensboro. She's also the author of a book called A Movement Without Marches. And the book that we're here to talk about is, again, a very new release. They Didn't See Us Coming: The Hidden History of Feminism in the 90s. So we have two very different scopes of work here. Dr. Levenstein's book is very much about a large kind of sprawling movement of feminist activism that has often been denied and erased, and we're going to talk about that, right? And Dr. Benjamin's book is about a single figure who had an enormous influence on various fields, right? Particularly Afro-American studies in the US academia. So one book focuses on a single person, the other book focuses on relations and in transnational feminism, but I found some pretty remarkable connections between these two works. And the first thing that I'm going to ask both the authors to speak about is the role of the absences that are at the core of both of these works. And they're different kinds of absences, I would argue. Dr. Levenstein, you're responding to what you see as a real erasure of some incredibly important activism work. And Dr. Benjamin, you're in many ways responding to and grappling with some disclosures that only came out after Dr. McKay's passing that were troubling. And there are other absences in both of your works, but these were two that I was really fascinated by. So could you speak a little bit as to what these absences meant to you in the motivation for writing your works?
Well, I'll go ahead and kick us off. Thank you for that question. You know, when I think about the absences and how it relates to why I wrote this book, you know, McKay was my advisor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And so while we were close and worked closely together in my work as a graduate student, I don't think I ever presumed that I knew all that there was to know about her. But after her passing, I realized that there was much she withheld, not just from me, not just from her students, but also from her colleagues in the profession. And I think that is probably the most profound part of this absence. So even if there were things that she didn't disclose with me, I probably would have presumed that those she was close to within the academy, she was making different types of disclosures. But it wasn't until she passed that I learned that not only was she older than we knew, she was about 10 years older than everybody thought she was, which is not entirely uncommon. But she also had been married, was a mother of two, even though we thought that she had never been married, she didn't have any children. And she actually introduced to her colleagues and friends in the academy her daughter as her sister. And so when I learned these things, I started to think about the kinds of choices that Black women make to have the kinds of careers and pursue the aspirations that others might not have for them. So I would say that in terms of an absence, there was the absence of that information, but I also think an absence in the way that we imagine the possibilities of Black women beyond their circumstance. And that is part of why I wrote Half in Shadow.
Let me just ask a follow-up, and then I want to hear what Dr. Levenstein says about her response to that same question. One of the things that fascinated me about your book is the way you both took on that disclosure, right, the posthumous disclosure, and addressed the ways in which that decision to represent her life differently in certain stages of her professional career on Dr. McKay's part. But you know, I felt that you did that with a remarkable combination of directness and respect, and you didn't try to come up with a neat answer for it.
No, I mean, I don't think that would have done justice to her as a subject and to the complexities of human existence. I think that her reasons shifted. I think that her experiences don't speak for the experiences of all Black women, because there are plenty who disclose information about their private lives without fear of any sort of backlash or not being able to advance in their careers because of it. So at the same time, I wanted to make a broader statement about Black women in the academy. I also wanted to focus on the individual life, because I think that there are so many nuances there in terms of her choices, that there were very specific reasons why she did what she did. And there were ebbs and flows in how she responded to it, whether she felt emboldened and empowered by her choices, or if she felt as though those choices had locked her into circumstances that really were not good for her overall health and well-being.
Right, absolutely. Dr. Levenstein, can you speak to, again, a very different kind of absence that motivates your work?
Right. Well, thank you so much for that question, Anne. I've spent really my whole career trying to understand how social movements work beyond famous leaders and kind of incidents of mass protests that command a lot of public attention. And I've been particularly interested in looking at the ways that people foster social change that don't involve marching on the streets. And I've really been drawn to people who have gotten overlooked because, and here we're talking about the absence, because they don't match that kind of stereotype we have of who is an activist. So this approach, looking at people and at activities that are not typically associated with social movements, this approach really proved very fruitful when I turned my attention to the feminist movement of the 1990s, which is the topic of my book. In 1998, Time magazine declared that feminism was dead. The cover story, it had that, posed that question. It said, "Is feminism dead?" That was the cover. And then if you opened up the magazine and you read inside, you would have learned that, yes, in fact, it is. It was dead. You know,
well, that's that
a movement that had kind of blossomed in the 60s and 70s, but by the 90s, it was really a shadow of its former self. You know, and I'd always been kind of suspicious of that narrative. And when I started going to the archives and conducting oral histories, I found that it was, in fact, an extremely pivotal decade for US feminism. It was a decade in which growing numbers of women of color, working class women, women from the global South who had been doing feminism for decades, but not using that label, they kind of decided they weren't going to let white women own that movement, right? They were going to claim it for themselves. It was also a decade in which the movement became more global. It expanded into mainstream institutions and nonprofit organizations, and it went online. So there was a lot happening in feminism in the 90s that Time magazine overlooked.
Great. And my next question really follows up from this theme of absences and even erasure on the part of Dr. Levenstein's book. I want to speak to you a little bit about methodology, because another connection I found in your work is that both of you had to delve quite deeply into personal archives, right? This was doing this kind of archival research often involves working with very personal papers, sometimes going into people's homes, right? So part of the erasure, Dr. Levenstein, that you're talking about, is that there's not an archive set up where all of this material is. You really did a lot of work to find individuals who were at these transnational conferences and so on. And similarly, Dr. Benjamin, you know, your work, you were entrusted in many ways with information, documents, stories that had not been shared before. So can you talk to us, both of you, a little bit about your methodology? And I'm particularly interested in the question of accountability, how you navigated the question of accountability with these sources that in many cases you might have been the first scholar to work with directly.
Well, I would say that in terms of my methodology, there were ways that I had to think very carefully about how I was going to use this information, because Deborah Gray White, the historian, talks about the reluctance of Black women to give their papers over to repositories and archives and things like that, because there is this inherent fear that whoever gets hold of those will misrepresent in some way, will skew the facts. And I would say in this way, my training as a literary scholar came in handy, because one of the things that I did as I was reading, I paid attention to themes and motifs and kind of ebbs and flows of information, so that in my accounting, I wasn't just focused on disclosing the most salacious information that I could, but instead to think also about the trends and sort of the overall arc of the materials that I came across. You know, when I interviewed folks, I asked for letters and I asked for other documents. Sometimes I received those redacted if they contained information about folks who were still living, and I respected that. And so my methodology was deeply informed by not just who I am as a Black woman and how I had to be careful about, or have an awareness of the need to be careful in my handling, not such that I would skew the facts or present a depiction of McKay's life that was out of step with what I came across in my materials. But I also had to choose based on the kind of story that I wanted to tell. And when I realized that this was about McKay's professional life primarily, then anything about her personal life, and there are some things that I nod to in the introduction in the early pages of the book, they didn't hold as much weight. And so I felt comfortable omitting those details because I knew that what I included was absolutely necessary to telling the story that I wanted to tell.
Great. Dr. Levenstein, what about you?
Yeah, I really did a combination of archival and oral history research and found that the two really complemented one another. So there actually are several feminist archives run by feminists. They might not use that label, but they essentially are. They're women's history archives that have made a real point of collecting the papers of both individual working class women and women of color in the US who have been active in feminism and other social movements, and also their organizations. So this work is really starting, and I was able to take advantage of that in my research in some very, very important ways. And I'll name the Sophia Smith collection at Smith College, the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard University, and the Sally Bingham Center at Duke University as being kind of key women's history archives who are preserving these papers and these collections. But it was really, it's such a back and forth between the oral histories teach you what to go look for in the archives, and then the archives can teach you what to bring up in an oral history, because folks sometimes need a little jog of their memory to remember something. I mean, one example, although I don't think anyone needed the jog, but one example because they remembered it anyway, but one example would be a flyer that I found. The Beijing Women's Conference of 1995 is a key event in my book in ways I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute, but I found a flyer from that event that was advertising what it called a lesbian dance party. And it was, I've actually reprinted this flyer in the book, and it was kind of half in Chinese and half in English, and it just kind of said time and date and come here. Well, that told me that something was happening, you know, at this conference that involved lesbians, involved a dance party, and I could, you know, kind of look at the address and see that it was in downtown Beijing. But what I didn't realize is what I found out when I started interviewing people about this party, which was that it was one of the most profound events that many of the US activists who attended this conference had ever been to in their lives. They showed up at this party. It was at a kind of disco bar in downtown Beijing. They arrived to find the sidewalk flanked with kind of military style police officers. because they had been under tremendous surveillance already from the police in Beijing. That they were out lesbians was not kind of okay with the state at this moment in China's history. And so they arrived at this party. There were military people everywhere. They got inside, more military, also kind of videoing them, as well as there with guns and watching. But what happened by all accounts was this kind of magical moment in which people who identified as lesbian, that was the word they used at the time, from all over the world, this had really descended to this bar, and they had a few drinks and the music was playing and they started dancing together. They couldn't really speak to each other across many geographical lines, but they could dance. And they were kind of dancing together in a way in defiance of this military presence that was there. And they were both at kind of feeling both at one, yet at the same time, many of the US participants were highly aware of how different this was for them than for the people there from China, for example, or from other, they were not worried about being caught on camera by the military police in the way that some of the people from other countries were. So they were both like feeling at one, but also aware of their privilege. And, it was just kind of extremely profound moment. Then they stayed up for hours afterwards with each other, talking about it, processing it, right? So from the archives, I got the pamphlet, I got the flyer. From the oral histories, I got this rich account of what happened. And so it really was a back and forth between those two that I think enabled me to capture some of the stories and the richness of the kinds of events and that were taking place at this time.
And just as you were speaking, it made me remember another theme that runs across these two books, which is the theme of inhospitable spaces. Spaces that are not designed to allow certain kinds of scholars, certain kinds of activism, certain kinds of bodies in many ways to flourish, and the suffering that inhospitality imposes, and the generative nature of it sometimes, right? Which should never be sort of used as a justification. Like I am not down with the whole suffering artist. That's the way to get to good stuff. Like, imagine all the great things that could happen if these inhospitable spaces were welcoming. Dr. Levenstein, you write a lot about the disabled feminists who came to some of those transnational conferences and the inhospitable nature of the space and the architecture. And of course, Dr. Benjamin, you write about the inhospitable space of the white academy, and that one of the most important legacies of Dr. McKay, right, as you say multiple times in the books, is field forming, literally doing the work of constructing new fields of inquiry. And an enormous important part about that for Dr. McKay was nurturing her graduate students, and in some ways giving her some models that were hard for her to identify herself.
Absolutely. When I think about the space that McKay entered into, so she went to Harvard in 1969. She started her career at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1977. And that was the only place she ever worked. So her entire career was focused on, really this life and legacy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. But I think one of the things that she learned at Harvard, because early on, she decided to take a leave of absence. And when she took a leave of absence, she was able to connect up with other Black women who were at other graduate institutions or who were in the area organizing. We know all about Combahee. And so this was when she was in Boston during that sort of formative era where Black women were coming together in very casual contexts, sharing what they knew about Black women's literature, books they had found, resources for one another. And so I think early on in her academic career, she understood the value of community. And so even when she went into these hostile spaces, she was always looking for opportunities to build this community, kind of as a way to escape what she knew was a hostile place, but also because in the interest of her project, which was to develop a field around Black women's literary studies, Black feminist thought, she knew that in order to get that work done, it needed to be collaborative. So when she was at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and at the time, African-American literature was not taught in the English department. And so she took the necessary steps to make sure that it would be. When she was working alongside other Black women at the Modern Language Association conference to make sure that panels that featured not just Black women, but the study of Black women's literature would be present, because there was, for years and years, it didn't exist. Now you would never think to look at an MLA program and that you wouldn't find any representation from African-American literature. But at the time, it was sort of catch as catch can. But when she collaborated with Frances Foster and Trudier Harris and others, she really, and this was by typing these memos and sending notes and saying, this is something I want to do. Would you be interested in doing it? And so I really appreciated what Lisa said about the archive, because you get a sense of how they were doing that work before the era of email and other forms of communication, where Nellie, where McKay was saying, okay, in order to form these connections, I need to build my community. And so no matter how hostile this space is for me, I need to make sure that I have my colleagues, that I have my peers around me, because in our focus on the work, it's something that not only energizes us, but emboldens us to press forward.
And Dr. Levenstein, do you want to speak a little bit about the importance of the activism of disabled feminists?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. So one of the reasons Time magazine thought the feminist movement was dead in the 1990s is that journalists didn't understand the kinds of spaces and forms of activism that people were engaged in. And one of the biggest examples of this is this Beijing conference of 1995. Most of us who were here in the US, what we learned about that conference was about Hillary Clinton, who gave a very celebrated address claiming that women's rights are human rights. And there's just a lot of attention around that. And it was, a fabulous speech and all, but what that attention on Hillary did was take away from the fact that at the same time that she was giving that talk, there were 40,000 activists from around the world, 40,000 gathered at like a massive conference where the program of the schedule events was 100 pages, right? I mean, this was like a massive feminist consciousness raising group.
And that's just the official events, right?
Right, exactly, right? So, I mean, it's this huge event that's happening that the media basically kind of misses. And so, and as part of that, people from across the US, including many marginalized communities, mobilized to get themselves to China. And one of those groups were women with disabilities who had been kind of knocking at feminism's door for decades and said, we're determined to do this. We know that it's in China, but we're going to show up there. And they organized contingents from around the world to show up at the conference. They decided that they were going to have a dual strategy at the conference. One was have panels about women with disabilities. Mm-hmm. The other was infiltrate all the other panels and show up and show how like disabled women's issues are part of all other issues, right? So if there's something about wage inequality, they're going to show up at that and say, and think about what it would mean if you included women with disabilities in this analysis. So in order to kind of plot this strategy and work together across, like kind of transnationally, they had a kind of pre-conference institute that they came together for a few days before the conference to share strategies, kind of get to know each other across nations, and come up with a plan of action for the conference itself. So the US, and this is just a perfect example of how kind of people, and what you were saying, Anne, about how people who are marginalized, sometimes that can be used in ways that are also, it's also kind of empowering. And the US group, they traveled, through the night to get to China. I don't know if you've ever done that trip, but it's not a pleasant one. And, and they're, many of them were in wheelchairs or deaf or blind, right? And so they do this cross country trip. They stopped in one place, changed planes. They get off in Beijing and they're traveling through the airport, exhausted, of course. And they came to a flight of stairs and an elevator to get down to where the kind of customs booth was. And the security personnel wouldn't let them take the elevator. Right. And they were kind of, no one spoke Chinese, even the US women. And so they were like kind of signaling, trying to figure out like why they can't take the elevator. And he pointed to like a painted line on the ground of the airport floor. And what they gathered from the kind of pointing that was happening was that the elevator was officially in China. The stairs were like what people who hadn't yet been formally admitted to the country were allowed to go down. There were actually two elevators. One was for the travelers, but the elevator they could have used was broken. So the other elevator was, you actually had to be admitted to the country first in order to use it. And so they were like, we're in wheelchairs. Like they were trying to explain, they're signaling kind of all this stuff, and they got nowhere with this, right? Finally, the security guard like called for some reinforcement. People came and they started lifting the wheelchairs up by the wheels. Like people weren't trained in how to lift wheelchairs. And so the women were like toppling out of the wheelchairs as people are pulling them up, right? And so finally they said, everyone just leave us, okay? And they just looked at these stairs, and people in wheelchairs got out of their wheelchairs. Many of those who could crawled down the stairs. Others kind of helped each other in various ways to get down these stone stairs. It took them, an hour to get everybody down the stairs, wheelchairs down the stairs. And that was like their welcome to China moment. Now, in that moment, tremendous bonds were forged among them, right? As they were later when they were traveling in the buses they had rented that in fact didn't really have good wheelchair tie downs. And so they were like, kind of going back and forth in these like empty buses. Like, there's these ways that certain kinds of somewhat traumatic experiences, when you go through them with people, there's bonding that happens, but at what cost, right? So this story about the stairs is one that was told to me several times. And yeah, it was very formative in ways that people still remember very vividly.
Yeah, that was that was one of the images from your book that really stuck with me. It wasn't the last time, right, that they struggled, that disabled feminist activists struggled at that conference. I'd like to switch now. I've been asking questions that sort of bridge the two books, and I'd like to ask at least one question of each of you that's more tailored to your own book. And I'd like to start with Dr. Benjamin. One of the things that's really striking about your book is how many different genres you use to contextualize, frame, and present Dr. McKay's narrative. You use literature, and not in a superficial way, right? In a really deeply meaningful way. You use your own narrative. You use lots of different kinds of disciplines and refer to political occurrences. So I wanted to ask you why you felt that this multidisciplinary approach was necessary to really sort of plumb the complexities of this figure's life.
Well, I think that Black feminism at its heart is multidisciplinary. Mm-hmm. And so for me, in order to present a full and rich accounting of McKay's life, that I had to honor all of those parts and all of those intersections, if you will, between the work of McKay as a literary scholar, as a mother, as a friend, as a mentor, as someone who was engaged politically, You know, a major part of my archive involved her correspondence with Nell Irvin Painter. And Painter gave me early access to those letters. And without those letters, I just would not have had the context. And because Painter is a historian, part of that had to do with their investment in leaving behind an archive for future considerations of a social history of Black women in the academy in the second half of the 20th century. So when I thought about the different ways that I would tell McKay's story, for example, you know, the political stuff, I couldn't divorce her presence at Queens in the mid to late 1960s away from the civil unrest that took place there, the taking over of university buildings, because all of that had an impact on how she saw herself as a scholar and what kind of impact she wanted to have as a teacher. When I thought about, or when I wrote about her essays, her books, there were just really some fascinating overlap between how she would describe her life in letters and what she would write about in her scholarship. So there was no way for me to kind of parse out, you know, this is happening independently of that. And I think that it's human nature, that we are these kind of relational beings, and the way that we build and grow is through this web of relationships. And so McKay not only had those professional relationships, but in terms of her thinking and how she imagined the work that she wanted to accomplish as a scholar, but also the impact that she wanted to have on us as graduate students. You know, I couldn't separate her investment in me from the first person narratives that I include in Half in Shadow, because there's so much about what I learned from her about how to be a Black woman in the professoriate that I had to question, that I had to reflect on and process based on the information that came to light later. That I wondered, okay, well, these were the choices that she made for her own life based upon being a Black woman born to immigrants in New York in 1930. Now, what kinds of opportunities do I have available to me? And do I feel as though there needs to be some pushback or a way to pivot from the sorts of things that I learned and the lessons that I inherited? So I just, and I have to say that that was probably one of the things that took me longest to wrap my head around, because I knew that there were these, and I would draft out, you know, a historical narrative, what she was writing about in terms of her scholarship, what was happening to her professionally and personally. And I would have these lines and these timelines. And I would try to think about how the narrative would move between these spaces. And it was probably one of the hardest things. I'm glad that it worked. I'm glad, you know, I'll take your question to mean that it worked.
It did work. It's more like a musical score. The way you're describing it sounds more like a musical score.
Well, thank you. I received that. I'll hold on to that because it was one of the more difficult parts of the process. But once I understood the through line, then I was able to more easily identify the points of emphasis on those different planes so that I could use that to unify the narrative throughout. So yes, thank you so much for that question.
And before we leave this point, this is a little bit of a rough segue, but I'm living in fear of ending this. We're not near the end yet, but I don't want to end without mentioning the Norton Anthology, because this is one of Dr. McKay's just astonishing legacies. And I also want to say, in your compelling description of how it came about, I'm guessing there were a lot of women academics who recognized themselves in that division of labor that you talked about.
Yes, well, this is one of the moments where sometimes what I came across in my interviews all of that detail didn't necessarily make it into the book. But I was able, I hope, to capture what was going on with Black women in terms of their Black male counterparts and this masculinist impulse in African American literary studies. There was a time when nobody believed that Black women's literature existed above and beyond Gwendolyn Brooks. And so what McKay and her counterparts had to do was to push back against that notion, but also to highlight their role as scholars in presenting a more comprehensive sense of the tradition. And so what she and her colleagues were doing in the formation of the Norton, they were making a very deliberate move in saying, we are not ancillary, we are not secondary. Black women writers, this is not something that you tack on at the end or that you plug in here and there. We must acknowledge the call and response. And if we want to talk about crafting a tradition, there is not just one tradition, because with the Norton, there were other anthologies that came out at the same time. But I would say that any of the back and forth during the formative stages of the Norton really captured what Black women were up against as they were trying to work against this depiction of them as race traders. When you talk about the backlash against Alice Walker's Their Color Purple, The Bluest Eye, Michelle Wallace, I mean, you can go on and
Zora
on.
Neale Hurston, right?
Zora Neale Hurston, I mean, we didn't fit.
Right.
These narratives that centered Black women just did not fit.
And at this point in time, even like Their Eyes Were Watching God, I believe was out of print at this point.
It was out of print.
Yeah.
It was out of print, and they came together and passed around a photocopied copy of, or mimeograph, that might have been the word that was used, a mimeograph version of Their Eyes Were Watching God. And that's how they began to think about and to recover Black women's literature. And so the Norton and the role of McKay, and also the gender balance that you see on the masthead, on the spine of that book, is really indicative of the work of Black feminist scholars who are saying that you cannot have these fields, you cannot have these disciplines if you don't have us.
And I just want to catch, we should have said this at the beginning of this topic, but what we're talking about is the Norton Anthology of African American Literature. That's the current title, and an incredibly important contribution to American literature writ large, and again, a field forming work that Dr. McKay served as co-editor with Henry Louis Gates Jr. Great. So let me turn back to Dr. Levenstein, and I wanted to ask you sort of, maybe this is another question about erasure, but I've been really interested in the Me Too movement, in the sort of, one of the responses to it is, well, that was the 80s. We had no idea of what sexual harassment was and what sexual violence was. And I think that's one of the corrective purposes of your book, to say, actually, there was lots of conversation going on here. And so I wanted you to speak to directly the transnational challenge and quality of the movement that you're describing. So how did that transnational element to the activism emerge, and what tensions were inherent in it?
Right. Thank you for that question. So the 90s is really the moment when the term globalization comes into our public lexicon. You can do these great Google searches where you see like a word and when its use kind of rises, and you can do that for globalization, and you see in the 90s, poof, right? People are starting to understand that, I mean, we've known this for so long, but I mean, it really begins to be something that people are talking about so much. We are in an interconnected world, right? What happens here is influenced by what happens elsewhere. We are interconnected. And so now feminists have known this for a long time, right? There have been the Beijing Women's Conference is the fourth world conference on women, right? So they had women had been meeting internationally for decades, for centuries, in fact, right? There's a long history of transnational women's activism among all kinds of feminists, right? With this kind of understanding that we live in an interconnected world. Well, in the 90s, what happens is both it is more people become aware of the need for this, and major foundations, because of what we're talking about globalization, are now also aware of the need for this and are funding transnational feminist activism. So, because it takes money, right? It takes money often, to be able to travel somewhere or bring people over to be able to, sit together in a room. At this point, people weren't using Zoom, right? So if you wanted to talk with people elsewhere, you were going to be faxing or you were going to be traveling, right? And the internet does start to emerge at this time, and it does really change things, but still, there was a lot of money that was needed for this kind of activism. So foundations begin to fund, and that's how so many women of color, working class women, get to the places like the Beijing conference. They get there because foundations, many, they could get grants to go to these environments. So there's more kind of public awareness of the need for this kind of work. What was very important about this work, I think, for the US activists who were involved in it was the sense of both A, the learning, and B, the sense of humility. So let me talk, these two things are connected. So it turns out that a lot of feminists from the global South, from countries in Latin America, from Asia, Africa, had been thinking critically and hard for over a decade about basically the rise of neoliberalism, basically about things like the role of the World Bank in shaping their lives and how it was promoting gender and racial and economic disparities, about the role of the IMF, about free trade, about all of these kind of global issues, and often that seemed economic in one ways, but had these kind of these impacts, differential impacts on women and on people of color, had been thinking. So these activists in the global South had been thinking critically about all kinds of things, about things like structural adjustment programs, these global capitalist realities that they felt that were significantly impacting their lives. And when the US activists came to these forums, they realized that they were a little bit behind in a certain sense. I don't like to think about progress narratives, but that's how they saw it. They said, oh my gosh, I've kind of only rarely heard about the World Bank, and here people are giving these in-depth feminist analyses, right, about how it's impacting their lives as farmers in, some rural area of West Africa. And, and it was really such a moment of learning. And so the US activists would come away from these spaces thinking about their lives in new ways. They started to think about things like welfare reform, which was happening in the US at this time, as part of a broader campaign of structural adjustment that was happening around the world, right? So they began to put their own experiences into a global framework. They recognized that they had so much to learn from activists in other countries. And they really, and this is true of all US activists, I would say, no matter, the people there were so diverse, racially, immigrant, in terms of immigrant status, sexuality. But everyone, I think, came away with some humility of, wow, they knew intellectually that they didn't have all the answers, but then to really get to these international forums and see how much they could learn and soak up and have their minds changed by talking with people across borders, it was really quite formative and something that has stayed with so many of them, kind of in years to come, and then became part of their practice, part of the way that they conducted their activism.
Right. Great. And I want to say one of the many questions that I have that we won't have get time for is I wanted to have you both talk about the central role that the Ford Foundation plays in both of the narratives that you draw out. We don't have time, But it's really, really fascinating that these foundations, particularly the Ford Foundation, has a hugely influential role, and quite, to be frank, right, an ambivalent one. So that's something that we won't get a chance to. I have one more question that I want to pose to both of you, and it's a big one. So it's gonna, I'm gonna encourage you to sort of take it in the way that you want to take it. In feminist activism, as it occurs now, the term intersectionality is really central. In my perspective, it's often bandied about in a pretty imprecise term, and often in a way that sometimes is exactly opposite to what I understand is to be part of the intellectual history of the term, more or less starting with Kimberly Crenshaw's famous article. I want you to speak to both the way in which you do or do not consider your own work intersectional, in terms of its methodology, in terms of its goals, and so on, its approaches, but also the degree to which your work is about intersectionality. So both how you're wielding it, how you're using it as a framework, and perhaps as a methodology, but also how you are describing intersectional realities that might otherwise, without an intersectional lens, right, not be allowed to be or not be portrayed in as much complexity. So to boil that down, how is intersectionality functioning in your work?
I will say that, the way that intersectionality, the way that it emerges in half and shadow, you're right, this is a big question. So I'm going to focus, I think, primarily on McKay's experience and her ascent within the academy, because not only was she the daughter of immigrants, she came from a working class background where money was often an issue. She did not come with a large degree of privilege. She was a straight woman. She was a woman with academic access and who had a degree of privilege that came about from her degree at Harvard. That degree also, in her mind, put a target on her back when it came to some of her white male colleagues at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The way that she mentored her students, I think, so she lived, the way that I wanted to portray her was through this lens that considered the complexities and how they were interwoven together. Because Kiyata Yamada Taylor's book on Combahee talks about, Kimberly Crenshaw's work, and then, she does another hop and takes it back as far as the Combahee River Collective, that statement. Right. So I think that in my depiction of who McKay was, that's one of the primary ways, one of the most obvious ways I see intersectionality playing in my in the book. But there's also a way, kind of off script, off the text, in her relationship with her graduate students and in her approach to mentoring. I think the intersectionality that grounded her, that she developed in her pedagogy, also emerged in her mentoring. And so it was never a one size fits all. It was a way of imagining all of these different responsibilities and desires, impulses, proclivities of her students who were coming, some of whom had families, others did not. Some were married, others were not. Some had lost, there was just such a wide range of experiences that her ability to see the complexities in those intersections was what allowed her to make the profound impact that she did within the academy and beyond it.
And of course, she required that. You have a very compelling scene in your work where you are summoned to Dr. McKay's office because this mentoring was, as you say, very personal and needed to be grounded in personal relationships than regular conversations, not all of which were easy ones. But I love that image when you arrived and you got the call that it was time to go to her office and have a formal meeting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you what you may be recalling is my colleague, Kim Blockett, when she first arrived. No, that's okay. That's okay. That's okay. Yes. Yeah. But I think absolutely, you know, she knew that Dr. Blockett, who's a professor at Penn State, was coming with a family, was coming with experiences and needs that needed to be accounted for, not just in the mentoring, but also in the way that the classes were set up. They changed the place of night classes in the English department because women with families would be at a disadvantage. So absolutely, you know, what you're saying, even though it didn't happen to me, it is a prime example of the way that she would leverage this intersectional approach to everything that she did in her academic work.
Yeah. Dr. Levenstein, how about you? What role does intersectionality play in your thinking and in your work?
Thanks so much for that question. It is a very big question. I think what I'd like to reflect on is that the activists in my book were all in some way involved in intersectional organizing. If we understand intersectional to be, have an awareness to be basically, they had a understanding of how feminist issues were multi-layered, that you cannot understand them without incorporating an analysis of both race and gender and economics together, and sexuality often together, that these things weren't independent issues, that they were fused, right? And you can't understand one without the other, and all of this needs to be addressed together, right? And so many of them did, you know, Kimberly Crenshaw's work was 1989, 1992, right? I mean, so they some of them had been like kind of formally trained in like these kinds of theories, but many of them, and they might use the term, but they also, so there's kind of that aspect of it. They had they really had a sense of how these things were interconnected. Second, they also, many of them, harken back to the Combahee River Collective much earlier, which pointed out that in order to make kind of lasting fundamental change that was going to free everybody, you needed to center those most marginalized, right? So with Combahee talked about, if we center Black women when we think about a problem, then the solutions we will come up with will free everybody. Because to address Black women's predicament would involve the destruction of all forms of oppression, right? So they had both so they had these two things were going at the same time. And what I like to think I try to do in the book is to, instead of, because I really appreciate what you say, Anne, when you say the word intersectionality now is used kind of all the time, yep. Often even by people who maybe just don't have a very good sense of what it means. It's used incorrectly. I try not to use the term itself too much, just like I very much at all. And, but to show how people who had these ideas in their head tried to affect change. How did they look at a situation and say, okay, this is what I'm going to do in order to try to affect positive feminist change. So for example, okay, let's look at poverty. What would it mean if I centered welfare recipients in this approach, right? What then does that tell me about what my activism needs to look like? If I'm in the environmental justice movement, let me look at the situation of Mexican Americans and Mexicans working in the maquiladoras, right? And let's like center their experiences and think about what that teaches us about labor rights and about environmental justice, right? Let's focus on their experiences in factories, and then let's like build a practice from there. If we're interested in issues of interpersonal violence, let's center women of color who do not trust the police, who do not trust the state. And let's try to come up with solutions that don't involve the police and the criminal justice system in order to liberate everybody, right? Let's think about doing the work with people who are most marginalized at the center, and let's see what kind of activism will flow from there.
Great. Well, thank you, both of you. I have so many more questions. I would have loved to dig into the correspondence between Painter and McKay, which I found so compelling. I wish we had gotten to tell the story of those feminist activists teaching each other how to do email in Beijing. I mean, there are some amazing images and scenes in both of these works that will linger with me for a very, very long time. So I want to thank both of you for all of the blood, sweat, and tears that you poured into these works that enrich our understandings of individuals like Dr. McKay, who we are indebted to, and movements like feminist movements in the 1990s that we are also indebted to. And now we find ourselves indebted to the two of you. So thank you for your work, and thank you for taking the time to unpack it just a little bit with me this afternoon.
Thanks so much,
Thanks for
Anne.
having me.
Thank you again for joining us for 21 Conversations. If you enjoyed this presentation, please like and share with your friends and fellow readers. One final reminder that Greensboro Bound is a nonprofit organization committed to bringing together readers and writers throughout the year at zero cost to our community. Please help Greensboro Bound maintain that commitment with a sustaining or one-time gift now. The number to text to give and our website are on your screen. Thank you. We look forward to seeing you in person next year.